had never known warmth, not truly. The world of my people was one of cold and harsh winds. Born in a settlement beneath the frozen peaks of our planet, I grew up surrounded by an endless stretch of white snow that blanketed the land in a shroud of isolation. The sun was a rare visitor in our world, and when it did shine, it offered little comfort, casting only a pale light across the frozen earth. The chill in the air was a constant companion, always biting, always present, no matter the season. It was a place where survival was a daily challenge, where the land itself seemed determined to make us fight for every breath. The Elkar people were survivors. That was the truth of it. We had learned to adapt, to endure, to fight against the relentless cold that sought to consume us. Over the years, we had built our settlement with stone and ice, creating homes that could withstand the fiercest storms. Our ancestors had been hardy, building this culture of self-reliance and fortitude. We were strong, or so we told ourselves. We were strong because we had no choice. There was no room for weakness here. Our hearts, too, had been hardened by the land. Compassion, kindness, these were things we had long left behind. There was no need for such things in a place like this. It was a lesson taught from birth. Trust no one but yourself. Even among our people, the bond of family was often overshadowed by the constant fight for survival. The storm, the cold, the endless search for food and warmth, these were the things that occupied our thoughts. To care for someone beyond what was necessary for survival was an indulgence, a vulnerability we could not afford. But in the deep corners of my heart, there was always a flicker of something different, something tender, something human. I had a child now, a daughter, Lariel. She was only 5, small and fragile, with the same fiery spirit that seemed to burn within all of us. Even she, though, could not escape the brutality of our world. I loved her more than anything, but I knew she was too young, too innocent for a life like this. The harsh reality of our world was cruel to even the most resilient. Every day I feared for her safety. Every day I prayed she would be strong enough to survive it. That morning, as the wind began to pick up, we had set out to gather the last of the supplies for the season. The storm was coming. I could feel it in the air. The sky had turned an unnatural shade of gray, and the wind howled louder than usual, as if the very earth was protesting. My instincts told me to turn back, to take shelter, but the need for supplies was too great. We had no choice but to push on, to gather what we could before the storm arrived in full force. Lariel clung to me as we trudged through the snow, her small hand tucked in mine. Her face was flushed with excitement, unaware of the dangers lurking ahead. I kept my gaze on the horizon, knowing that the storm was coming closer, but trying to keep my thoughts steady. I couldn't afford to panic, not now. I had to be strong for her. But in that moment, I heard it. The distant sound of something not quite right. My heart skipped a beat. Lariel had already broken free from my grasp, running ahead, her laughter lost in wind. My call was swallowed by the storm before it reached her, and I felt a surge of panic rise in my chest. I ran after her, my legs burning with effort, my eyes squinting against the blowing snow. I couldn't see her. I couldn't hear her. Only the storm. The cold, endless storm. The storm had come faster than we expected, a brutal force that seemed to rise out of nowhere, sweeping through the settlement like a monstrous tide. It wasn't just a flurry of snow. It was as though the sky itself had opened up to unleash its fury upon us. The winds howled louder now, biting through my cloak and cutting deep into my skin, making it impossible to think clearly. Each step felt like I was sinking deeper into a frozen nightmare. The world around me was a blur of white, a veil of snow and ice that swallowed everything in its path. I couldn't see her, couldn't hear her. Lariel, my precious child, had vanished into the storm. The terror that gripped my chest was unlike anything I had ever known. I had always known that our world was dangerous, that the cold could take anything from us in an instant. But the thought of losing her, of never seeing her bright eyes or feeling the warmth of her hand in mine again, sent a chill deeper than the one biting at my skin. She was small, fragile. In this storm, she was nothing but a shadow in a sea of white. And I was nothing but a mother, helplessly searching for her. I called her name over and over, my voice muffled by the wind, but it was no use. The storm swallowed it up, rendering me silent in its deafening roar. The snow, thick as a blanket, was growing heavier by the minute, and every direction seemed the same. There were no landmarks, no guideposts in this blinding whiteness. My breath came in sharp, freezing gasps, and I could feel the frost beginning to settle in my bones. Panic clawed at me, but I pushed it down, focusing all my energy on the task at hand. I had to find her. I couldn't stop now. I stumbled through the snow, every step more laborious than the last. The wind whipped against my face like 1,000 needles, sharp and relentless. I thought I saw something, a flicker of movement in the snow, but it was gone as quickly as it came, lost to the storm's fury. It had to be her. I couldn't give up, not when there was even the slightest chance that she was still out there, that she was still alive. Minutes felt like hours, and hours like days. The sky above was no longer visible, only a gray abyss that seemed to stretch on forever. I felt the cold creeping into my bones, dulling my senses, turning my thoughts to fog. I tried to keep my focus, but the storm seemed to be swallowing everything, devouring it whole. The only thing that remained was the emptiness, the awful, aching emptiness of not knowing. I called her name again, my voice cracking with desperation. "Lariel!" But there was no response. The storm had taken everything from me, and in that moment, it felt as though it had taken my hope as well. By the time I realized I could no longer continue, that the storm had beaten me into submission, it was too late. I staggered back toward the settlement, numb to the world around me. My mind was a haze, the sharp, biting cold making everything feel distant, far away. I had lost her. My child, my little Lariel, was gone, taken by the merciless storm. I had failed her. I had failed as a mother, as a protector. As I finally reached the settlement, I collapsed to my knees in the snow, utterly spent, my heart heavy with the unbearable weight of loss. There was nothing left, only the storm and the cold, and the ache in my chest that would never go away. Hours passed in an agonizing blur, and as the storm began to ease, the cold seemed to settle deeper into my bones. The wind was no longer howling as fiercely, but the quiet was just as deafening, suffocating in its emptiness. I was numb, physically and emotionally, the weight of what had happened crushing me under its unbearable heaviness. The village had gathered, but no one spoke. There was no need for words. Everyone knew. The look on their faces said it all. The storm had claimed another life. I had no strength left, but I couldn't help but feel the need to keep moving, to keep searching, even though I knew in my heart that it was pointless. The storm had taken her. Lariel was lost to the ice, and there was nothing I could do to bring her back. But then, just as the last remnants of the storm started to fade into the night, something caught my eye, a flicker of movement against the white expanse. For a moment, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, a desperate wish for something, anything, to break the suffocating silence. I rubbed my eyes, but the movement was still there, a shadow against the swirling snow. I squinted into the distance, my heart racing with a sudden irrational hope. The figure was small but unmistakable. A human. I froze, my breath catching in my chest. Humans! They had arrived on our planet a few years ago, strange beings from another world, and their presence had been met with skepticism, even distrust. They were different from us, smaller, softer, less equipped to survive in such a harsh environment. Our people had never truly understood them, had never fully accepted them. They were weak. Or so we thought. But now, here one was, braving the storm, moving steadily across the snow with a purpose that seemed impossible given the circumstances. The figure drew closer, and I could see that it was indeed a human, a man, dressed in heavy, fur-lined clothing, his face hidden beneath the hood and scarf that shielded him from the biting wind. He didn't seem to hesitate, didn't falter despite the storm's remnants still clinging to the land, the snow and ice caked around his boots as he moved forward with determination. My heart pounded as I watched him approach. Why was he here? What was he doing in the middle of this storm, risking his life in a place like this? The answer came quickly when he knelt down, his movements swift and efficient, scanning the snow as if searching for something, someone. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what he was doing. The human had found her. Lariel. She lay half buried in the snow, unconscious and pale, her small form barely visible beneath the blanket of ice and frost. Her tiny body was stiff with the cold, her face frozen in a look of peaceful stillness that made my heart ache. I wanted to scream, to run toward her, but my feet were frozen in place, my body too weak to move. I had already failed her once, but this stranger, this human, he had not given up. He wasn't frozen by fear or the elements. He was doing what I should have done, what I had failed to do. Without a word, the human scooped my child into his arms, lifting her with a gentle yet sure grasp, as if her fragile form was the most important thing in the world. My breath caught in my chest as I watched him, the stranger who had somehow become my salvation. He was carrying her, protecting her from the cold, without any hesitation. There was no question in his movements, no doubt in his eyes. For a brief moment, I wondered if I was dreaming. Perhaps I was still trapped in the grip of the storm, hallucinating this figure, this miracle. But the human turned and began to make his way back toward the settlement, Lariel still nestled safely in his arms, her small head resting against his chest. And with each step he took, the darkness that had settled over me began to lift, just a little. I had never known compassion, not truly, not in the way that I had felt it in that moment. And yet this human, this stranger, had shown me something more powerful than strength. He had shown me what it meant to care, to risk everything for someone else. It was something I had never understood until now, something I had never seen on our planet. He was saving my child. And in doing so, he was saving me as well. The human carried Lariel through the storm's fading remnants, his steps sure and steady despite the conditions. He didn't falter, didn't hesitate, not even when the winds tried to tear at him, pushing back with the fury of the ice. I followed at a distance, my heart racing, unsure of what I was witnessing. Every instinct told me to hurry, to reach my child. But there was no need. The human had already done what I had not been able to do. He had found her, cradled her, and was bringing her back to the safety of the settlement. As he drew closer, my mind began to clear, the fog of panic lifting just a little. The village appeared ahead, a faint silhouette against the vast whiteness of the snow. I could see the flickering light of the fire that burned in the center of the settlement, offering some semblance of warmth in this frozen world. But there was something else, something unfamiliar about the way the human moved. There was no rush in his pace, no urgency that would have been natural for anyone else. He walked with a calmness that seemed at odds with the chaos around us, a quiet assurance that spoke volumes more than words could. I finally caught up with him as he entered the settlement, his breath forming visible clouds in the air as he continued his journey toward the fire. His hands were gentle as he adjusted Lariel in his arms, cradling her as if she were something precious, something worth protecting. There was no fear in him, no hesitation. He simply moved with purpose, his every action focused on one goal: to save her. The others in the settlement watched in silence as the human approached, his figure framed by the soft glow of the firelight. They had not expected this. None of them had. I could see their surprise, their confusion, but no one spoke. The silence of the moment hung heavy in the air. There was only the sound of the wind dying down and the crackling of the fire. It was as if, for a brief moment, the world had stopped turning and all that remained was this one human holding my child in his arms. Without a word, the human knelt by the fire, placing Lariel down gently onto a pile of furs that had been set out for her. He was quick but careful, his hands steady as he began to work, rubbing her tiny limbs, trying to coax warmth back into her frozen body. His movements were deliberate, precise, as if he had done this 100 times before. He did not speak, did not ask for help. He simply acted. I stood at a distance, my body still trembling from the cold, but now a different kind of tremor ran through me. It was awe, a deep, humbling sense of awe. I had seen strength before, in my people, in the way we survived against the harshness of our world. But this was something different. This was a kind of strength I had never understood, a quiet, selfless strength that sought only to help, to heal. It was not something born of necessity or survival. It was born of something deeper, something human. The fire crackled in front of us, and as I stood there watching the human work, I began to understand. I had lived my life in a world where survival was everything, where compassion was a weakness, something to be discarded in favor of strength and endurance. But here, in the silence of the settlement, in the glow of the fire, I began to realize that there was more to life than simply surviving. This human, this stranger, had shown me something profound. He had shown me that compassion was not a weakness, not something to be feared or abandoned. It was a strength, a power greater than anything I had ever known. For the first time, I felt something I had long forgotten. Hope. It bloomed slowly, tentatively within me. My child was alive. She was safe. And it was because of this human, this person who had risked his life for someone he didn't even know. There was no gain for him in this, no reward, only the quiet satisfaction of knowing he had done what was right. And as I watched him, I knew that my world was changing. What I had thought was impossible was now unfolding before my eyes. Compassion, I realized, was not a weakness. It was a gift, one that could save not just a child, but an entire people. The warmth of the fire seeped into my frozen limbs as I stood by, watching the human continue his ministrations. Lariel's body had begun to respond to the heat, her limbs twitching as the blood started to circulate again. I held my breath, waiting for a sign, a single movement that would confirm that she was truly going to be okay. The human's hands never faltered, working with a methodical rhythm, rubbing her skin gently to stimulate the warmth back into her. The others gathered around, but none of them spoke. The village, usually so full of life and noise, had become eerily silent in the presence of this stranger. It was a silence filled with wonder, with disbelief. No one had ever seen anything like this before. The human didn't seem to notice the eyes upon him, nor did he care. His focus remained solely on my child, and in that moment, nothing else mattered. Lariel's breathing, shallow and ragged when he first placed her down by the fire, began to steady. A faint color returned to her cheeks, and I felt my chest loosen, my heart beginning to believe again. There was a chance. Against all odds, there was a chance she would survive. The storm, the ice, the endless cold, they had all tried to take her. But this human had pulled her from the jaws of death itself, against all the laws of nature that had governed our existence for as long as we had known. I watched him as he worked, his face hidden beneath the scarf and hood, his eyes focused entirely on the task at hand. His movements were deliberate and practiced, as though he had done this countless times. It was a strange thing to see someone so alien to our world acting with such confidence and skill. How had he learned this? Why had he come to us, to our desolate corner of the universe, to risk everything for the sake of a stranger's child? Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the human stopped. His hands rested gently on Lariel's shoulders, his eyes scanning her body for any further signs of distress. He looked up at me then, and for the first time I saw his eyes clearly, unclouded by the distance or the wind that had obscured them before. They were calm, steady, filled with an unspoken "She will be fine," he said, his voice soft but firm, the foreign accent of his language unfamiliar but comforting all the same. "She just needs rest now. The worst is over." I felt a rush of relief flood through me, and I sank to my knees beside Lariel. I reached for her hand, touching it with trembling fingers, the warmth of her skin a stark contrast to the ice that had claimed her moments before. Her small fingers curled around mine, and a tear slipped down my cheek before I could stop it. I hadn't even realized I had been holding my breath, waiting for this moment. The human didn't speak again, but I could see the quiet satisfaction in his eyes. He had done what I thought was impossible, and he had done it without hesitation, without any expectation of reward. His actions had been driven by something more than survival, more than duty. He had saved my daughter's life simply because he could, and that truth, that quiet power, hit me harder than anything else I had ever known. The village began to stir once more, as if waking from a long, stunned silence. People started to move, gathering close to the fire, offering their thanks in silence, unsure of how to express the gratitude that swelled in their hearts. The human's presence had been a shock to them, as it had been to me, but now, in the presence of this small miracle, we were no longer strangers. We were no longer the ones who survived at the cost of others. We were something more. Something that had been reawakened, something that could once again care for one another. I turned to face the human, my throat tight with emotions I could not name. There was no way to thank him, no words that would ever be enough for what he had done. But as I looked into his eyes, I understood that no thanks were needed. He had done what was right, and for that he had earned something far greater than mere words. He had earned a place among us. And so, as I watched him rise to leave, I knew that everything had changed. Our world, once ruled by the cold, was now governed by something else, something warmer, compassion. It was something I had never seen before, but it was now something I could never unsee. The days that followed the storm were filled with quiet reflection and slow recovery. Lariel's condition improved steadily, though she remained weak, her small body having endured far more than any child should ever have to. But she was alive, and that was all that mattered. She clung to me as I tended to her, her bright eyes already beginning to sparkle again, though her body still trembled from the ordeal. The warmth of the fire, the food, the soft furs that surrounded her, these things helped her heal, but it was the quiet presence of the human that had made all the difference. He had stayed with us for a time, offering no explanations, no demands. He was an enigma, a stranger from a distant world, yet he moved through our settlement as if he had always belonged here. The others in the village watched him closely, unsure of what to make of his presence. I could see the wariness in their eyes, the suspicion that had followed the arrival of the humans to our planet. But the human did not shy away. He stayed, and in doing so, he proved something to all of us. He had shown us what it meant to care without expectation. He had shown us what it meant to sacrifice, to risk everything for someone else, without thought of reward. It was a lesson that seemed to challenge everything we had ever known about our own survival. In our world, trust was scarce. To care for others, truly care, was considered a weakness. But the human had broken that barrier with his actions. His kindness was a strength we had never understood. Yet now, in the quiet aftermath of the storm, we could not deny its power. As Lariel slept peacefully beside me, I watched the human from across the room. He was sitting by the fire, speaking with a few of the elders, his voice low and steady, though I could not understand his words. The language was foreign to me, but his presence, his calm, spoke louder than any words could. He was at ease, despite the fact that he had come from another world, another life. And yet here he was, offering his help, offering his strength, without question. The village had slowly begun to open up to him. It was not instantaneous. Trust, after all, is not easily earned, but it was happening. The elders, once suspicious, now regarded him with a kind of quiet respect. His actions had spoken louder than any diplomacy could have. The human had shown us that there was more to survival than just enduring the cold, than just fighting the elements. There was something deeper, something that could bind us all together, even in the harshest of conditions. I found myself wondering about him, about where he had come from, what had brought him to our world. He had saved my child, yes, but there had to be more to him than that. What drove him? What had he seen in this bleak, frozen world that made him risk everything to help us? But when I asked him, when I tried to understand his story, he only smiled that soft, distant smile of his. "I'm here because I can be," he had said simply, his voice quiet and unwavering. "Because you needed help." His answer was a riddle, one I didn't fully understand, but somehow it made sense. He wasn't here for glory or riches or recognition. He wasn't here for any reason other than the simple truth that we had needed him. He had seen something in us, something worth saving, and for that, I was eternally grateful. As the days passed, Larry grew stronger and I could see her curiosity returning. She began to ask questions about the human, what his name was, where he came from, how he had learned to survive in the storm. His name, he told her, was Jalen, but the rest, the details of his life, remained a mystery. It wasn't important though, not really. What mattered was that he had given us something that we had long forgotten. He had reminded us of the power of kindness, of selflessness, and in doing so, he had changed us all. In the stillness of those quiet days, I found my heart shifting. The world was still cold, still unforgiving, but it no longer felt as impossible to bear. There was warmth here, in this small, unlikely corner of the universe, and it had come from the most unexpected of places. A human who had shown us that survival, real survival, was not just about fighting the cold. It was about fighting for each other. As the weeks passed, a transformation began to take place, both within the village and within me. The cold, which had always felt like an insurmountable barrier, no longer held the same power over us. It was still harsh, still biting, but somehow it seemed less daunting now. There was warmth among us that I had never truly known before. It wasn't just the fire, though that provided comfort. It wasn't just the food, though that nourished us. It was something deeper, something that had taken root in our hearts. Compassion, the quiet strength that Jalen had shown us. The others in the village began to open up, slowly at first, but more surely with each passing day. They watched Jalen, saw how he moved with such ease among us, not as an outsider, but as someone who genuinely cared. He helped where he could, offering his skills, his knowledge, and in doing so, he bridged the gap between our people and his own. There were still moments of uncertainty, still looks of skepticism, but they were fewer now, and those moments were fleeting, replaced by the quiet realization that Jalen was no longer a stranger to us. He had become a part of our lives, just as much as any of us. I found myself learning from him in ways I had never imagined. His patience, his quiet strength, were things I had never fully understood before. I had always believed that survival required a fierce independence, that we had to rely solely on ourselves to endure the harshness of our world. But Jalen had shown me something else, that survival was about more than just enduring. It was about living with each other, supporting one another, even in the most difficult of circumstances. His presence had made that truth undeniable. Larielle, too, had begun to change. Her energy had returned, her laughter filling the air again as she played with the other children. She would run to Jalen sometimes, her small hands reaching for his, her eyes filled with trust, and he, without hesitation, would take her hand, guiding her in ways that spoke of a deep understanding. It was clear that the bond they shared had grown stronger, that the love he had shown her during the storm had created something unspoken between them. She had come to think of him as a protector, as someone she could rely on, just as I had. One evening, as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the village, I found myself sitting beside him, watching the sky darken with the coming night. The fire crackled softly in front of us, the warmth of its flames a quiet comfort. I turned to him then, the words finally forming in my mind. "Why did you come here?" I asked softly, the question lingering between us. "What was it that made you risk everything for us?" Jalen didn't immediately answer. He stared into the fire for a long moment, the flickering light dancing across his features. I couldn't read his expression, but there was something peaceful about it, something deep. "I came because," he paused, looking at me with those steady, calm eyes. "I saw people who needed help, and I could help, that's all. No grand reason, just the need to make a difference, to show that kindness isn't a weakness." His answer was simple, and yet it was more profound than anything I could have expected. He wasn't looking for recognition or glory. He wasn't even trying to change our world. He had simply come because he could, because there was something in him that couldn't ignore the suffering of others. And in that moment, I understood. The change that had begun in our village, the change that had started with him, was not about him as an individual. It was about something greater. It was about the power of compassion, the strength in caring for each other, even when the world seemed to offer nothing but ice and cold. He had shown us that we could be more than survivors. We could be a community, bound together not by the harshness of the world, but by the kindness we offered one another. As the night grew darker and the stars above began to shine, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. The world was still cold, still difficult, but it no longer felt as though we were alone in it. The human had shown us that we didn't have to face it alone. And for the first time in my life, I believed that we could survive, not just because of our strength, but because of the strength we had found in each other. Jalen had changed us all in ways I hadn't even known were possible, and for that I would be forever grateful.